Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Marti Flacks, Director of the Human Rights Initiative and Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism. 6 months ago this week, the last U.S. troops withdrew from Afghanistan following the unexpectedly rapid capture of Kabul by the Taliban and the solidification of its control across the country. The Taliban back in power in Afghanistan resurfaced memories of the severe repression Afghans experienced in the late 1990s and early 2000s, particularly against women and girls. Some argue that at this time that the Taliban has evolved its views on human rights issues as a result of the past several years of international engagement and the relationships they've established with some in the international community. But certainly over the last 6 months, we've seen a return to many of the practices that we saw the last time the Taliban was in power. We will hear from our guests today, the current situation in Afghanistan, what's happening on the ground, and the positions that the U.S. and others are taking in response. We're going to talk a lot today about how we think about this Taliban regime. On the one hand, we know they are exploiting a radical misinterpretation of Islam to justify severe repression, especially of women, and imposing restrictions that no other Muslim country has done. And in that sense, this is a unique human rights challenge for all of us to think about and address. On another level, however, the Taliban can be seen as just another authoritarian regime, imposing restrictions like freedom of speech and assembly, attacking human rights activists and journalists, disappearing or extrajudicially killing political opponents in ways that have very little to do with their so-called ideology and are simply the tactics of authoritarians everywhere. And in that sense, the challenge in Afghanistan mirrors one that we're facing in many regimes and many countries around the world. So how do we develop and deploy strategies that tackle both of these layers of the human rights situation in Afghanistan? Here to help us talk about the latest developments on the ground and to help us unpack some of these challenges, we have a fantastic panel of experts with us today, and I look forward to introducing them and hearing from them in a few minutes. Before we get to those speakers, however, we're going to start with a keynote address from a special guest. I am so pleased to have with us today our keynote speaker, Special Envoy Rina Amiri. Special Envoy Amiri is the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights. Under the Obama administration, she also served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. She previously served in the United Nations as a senior mediation expert and a member of the UN SRSG's political team in Afghanistan. And she's held leadership positions at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, at Princeton University, at NYU, and she's a founding member of Inclusive Security, a global women's initiative advocating for the inclusion of women in peace processes. So we could not have a more expert and more experienced person leading the U.S. government to think about these issues of human rights in Afghanistan, and I'm so pleased that she's with us today. Special Envoy Amiri, we welcome your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good evening for those of you in other time zones. I want to begin by thanking CSIS for having this really important discussion. It's a critical time. It's hard to imagine that only 6 months have passed since the Taliban takeover. The situation has changed so radically for the Afghan population that for many it feels that it's a lifetime that has been condensed into 6 months. And as you noted, there had been hopes that we would see a Taliban that was different from the Taliban that ruled in the 1990s. And what we've seen has not materialized in the way that we hope. The Taliban see things very differently. They note that they have ended the conflict, but for many Afghans, particularly for women and minority groups, vulnerable populations, it feels quite the opposite. On August 15th, when the Taliban rolled into Kabul, and prior to that, when they had taken over provinces, one of their first enactments was retracting women's rights. Women were told to go home from work and were kept out of public space. And immediately we saw a series of decrees and positions from the Taliban that echoed the past. Women being told that they could not have leadership positions, being told that they could not go beyond secondary school, or having restrictions placed at that point. The issuance of statements that women would need marams to travel beyond I think it was 40 miles. So in many respects, Afghan women felt, the women who woke up on August 15th as leaders, as parliamentarians, as workers, as people who could contribute to the economy of their family, who had voice and who had agency, were suddenly stripped of it overnight. And beyond that, other parts of the rights-based population, the journalists community, those that had been at the forefront of media freedom, which was considered one of the greatest successes of the last 2 decades, suddenly found their space shrinking. Religious minorities found themselves subject to harassment, to the seizure of their properties, and we know this not as systematically as we should, because we no longer have eyes and ears on the ground. But nonetheless, we are hearing from communities throughout the country, and we're hearing them also not just through our sources, but from the Afghan women and men who were forced to flee Afghanistan, but who still have their ear to the ground, who have just very strong links into the country. People like Horia Mosadiq, who I'm so happy to see on this panel, are working around the clock. I'm on various WhatsApp groups, and any time of day or night that I pick up my phone, I see them engaging on this issue. I see them vigilantly monitoring the situation on the ground. And I cannot emphasize how important of a role that they're playing. In addition, the women and men inside the country who are taking enormous risks to stand up for their rights and to make sure that the international community is held accountable, that they can see and hear if they want to. And that the situation is, is one that we should be concerned about from a normative perspective, from a strategic perspective. The Secretary Blinken recognized this, and that is why he established my office and asked me to take on this position as a special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights. As he himself has noted, an inclusive Afghanistan that is an essential part of the equation towards a stable Afghanistan. I have been heartened in that I have received support from throughout the government on this issue. It's not, I must confess that when I came in, I was concerned that it would be, a marginalized issue, as sometimes can happen on the issues of women's rights and human rights. And that has not been the case. And I do believe that my office can play an important role I have to note that it is an incredibly challenging context in terms of our own leverage, in terms of how dramatically the context has changed, and in terms of a devastating humanitarian situation where we have, the risks that the Afghan population face in terms of, half of the population is at risk of acute food shortage and malnutrition. And at the same time, having a situation that is extremely grave in regard to human rights, and that is only, by the assessment of not just my office, but when I speak to the international community, that is getting more challenging. It is incumbent upon us to look at our sources of leverage and identify how we're going to move forward. So I want to give you a sense of how I'm approaching this incredibly challenging task in this very tenuous time. One is my portfolio is about inclusion, and my process is about inclusion. And at the top of that list is Afghan women and men themselves. I do not represent Afghan women. My role is to create a platform and leverage their voices. And that's something that I take very seriously. And I'm in regular contact with Afghan women, both outside and inside the country. I have to note that inside is much more challenging, but what I'm looking to do is establish consultative mechanisms both inside and outside Afghanistan. That is different from, some have recommended establishing a women's advisory board. I want to have something that is broader than that and that enables the continuous involvement of new voices, both from the ground and those that are in communities in the US and elsewhere. And that's something that my office is working towards, and engaging a variety of different think tanks in Washington, DC, New York. And I'm also looking to establish a virtual platform to engage Afghans directly in the country in a way that does not compromise their security. Two, I am prioritizing having an alignment of position among our allies, including European allies, but broader than that. And also really emphasizing on bringing the voices of Muslim majority countries into this conversation. We have to take stock of where we are. 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, the position of the West was much more salient than the region and the Islamic world. That has changed. The countries that have embassies inside Afghanistan right now are largely regional countries and Muslim countries. There are far fewer European embassies, and they need to use their voice to advocate for inclusion. And not just, some are doing it. They're talking about political inclusion. They're talking about ethnic inclusion. But there's very little that's come from the region in terms of the inclusion of women. And all of that has to be factored in when we talk about inclusion. And, recently, I just came back last week from a visit to Jeddah and to Qatar, and this is what I hope to be the first of many trips to Islam majority countries to engage them on this issue. What I noted to them is, what the Taliban are saying about women's rights and making the argument that it's on the basis of Sharia is not just bad for Afghanistan and for Afghan women, it's bad for Islam. This is the issue, where the Taliban are getting a lot of attention in terms of the regressive practices that they're enacting. And for the majority of the world looking at this issue, when the Taliban say that it's in accordance to Sharia, they take note of that. And the actors that need to be leading and countering that narrative is the Muslim majority countries. And when they engage the Taliban, what I've asked them to do is include women in their delegation, show that women are playing prominent and strong roles in their own countries, particularly where they have senior leadership, and the majority of the Muslim world does. And second, when they engage the Taliban, they should also engage women. In the Oslo discussions that took place last month, I was heartened that when the Taliban engaged the Norwegians for a meeting in Oslo, one of the requirements was that they had to engage women in civil society, and that was important. Regardless of one things about that discussion, whether it was too early, whether that in some way created a more positive environment for the Taliban. A really important element of that was that the Taliban sat across Afghan civil society, both from outside as well as inside the country. Half of them were women leaders, women activists, and had a discussion in which I think the Taliban walked away with a different perspective in terms of at least the range of leadership inside both inside and outside the country. There are those elements of the Taliban who've been sitting in Qatar and have had engagements for 2 years. And some of them perhaps have modified their perspective and have developed a more pragmatic lens. Many have not. Many have not had that type of exposure and that type of engagement. So I do believe that it'll be really important to advance that type of engagement. I myself have also taken the position that in my capacity, in my role, it's very important for me to engage the Taliban. And to that end, I was part of the Oslo discussions. I think it was after the first week of my appointment. I was appointed in January, very soon, a couple of weeks into my appointment, I had that discussion with the Taliban, where I was the only woman among the special envoys and special representatives to engage them at that level. And I was able to bring it, before I went, and this is an important lesson also for the international community, I engaged with Afghan women themselves. I asked them to identify their priorities. And this is, Horia Jan was also part of that discussion, to tell me what messages to take to the Taliban, so that there was a direct linkage with Afghan civil society, Afghan voices, and I took their priorities. I took their priorities on education, and not just education, but linking education to employment. That education on its own is, it's a good step, but it's woefully insufficient, particularly in a country as poor as Afghanistan. Education is a means to employment, is a means of getting food on the table. And in the absence of a framework that includes all of that, and a national decree where the country as a whole understands that the Taliban authorities are allowing and enabling education and women's right to work, a culture of fear and intimidation will prevent them from taking advantage of those opportunities. We've already seen that with the opening of higher education facilities, where very few families are sending their daughters to school. I also met with them recently in Qatar with the Taliban Political Commission, and I put all of these issues forward. And I put it forward in terms of making the case. You have said that you have ended the conflict, but the conflict is only at a pause. And in the absence of inclusivity, the conflict will not come to an end. If you want, and they've said many things. They've said that they're ending the conflict. They have said that they want a country that is less reliant on the donor community. They have said that they want to improve their relationship with the West. My response has been, don't just focus on improving your relationship with the West, improve your relationship with Afghans inside the country. Build confidence, not just by having inclusivity of a few actors from different ethnic groups, but an inclusive process that is transparent, that engenders confidence among the population. They've made very positive signals in terms of getting girls back in school after the new year. And I've said, put out a national decree so that the entire country sees that this is a step that you're taking to engender confidence, that you're moving in the direction that the country wants to see, and do the same on employment. On the issue of detentions, their perspective is that they're detaining people as a part of their rule of law, and that they are making inquiries on where they feel that there are violations. And my response has been, you cannot just detain people and their families in the way that you've been doing and expect that you are in any way going to build confidence with the Afghan population, let alone the international community. You need to build processes. And I think those are the strategic arguments that have to be brought to the fore in discussions with the Taliban, with the region, and with other actors. We need to make the arguments for human rights and women's rights on the basis of normative principles, but also strategic principles, because we cannot once again say peace before justice. It's a very short-sighted lens, and as Afghan leaders themselves have said, people like Fatima Gilani have noted, everything is connected, everything is interwoven in Afghanistan. The humanitarian situation, the political situation, the human rights situation. You will not achieve political instability in Afghanistan without inclusion. If the process continues in the way that it has, and the last 20 years, Afghans have been able to see their reflection in the Afghan government. Whatever weaknesses that the Islamic Republic had, there was diversity both at the national level and the subnational level, and processes, electoral processes, as flawed as they were. And the absence of that there is a likelihood that you're going to get further defections to IS and other groups, and that you are going to see greater violence, a violence that is going to threaten Afghanistan, the region, and also lead to further migration outside and at the doorsteps of Europe and the US. In terms of humanitarian issues, you cannot say just humanitarian first and then we'll bring inclusion, because the people that are most affected by the horrible situation in Afghanistan and on the humanitarian level, it's again women and girls. And every conflict that's a case, and in Afghanistan, it's just as acute, if not more. Women have to be recipients, the service providers and recipients, women and girls, in order to get food and resources to the most vulnerable, and getting education and work put together as a package is the one way that the Taliban could prevent a further brain drain in Afghanistan, and the region could prevent further spillover of refugees into their borders. Afghanistan is a place that cannot just simply be contained. I know that there's wishful thinking that you could just make Afghanistan go away. It doesn't go away. We've seen this in the last several decades, over 4 decades. The instability in Afghanistan will bleed into to the region and will bleed into Europe and the US. And so if it's not going, if the arguments are not compelling to those that are looking at these issues from a moral and normative perspective, it should be seen from a strategic perspective. So with that, I turn to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Special Envoy Amiri. Fascinating remarks, and especially fascinating to hear exactly how you all are trying to navigate that dynamic between the philosophical, ideological component of this regime and the practical, realistic piece of how they're going to govern this country, and can they keep this country in their perception at peace. Really challenging situation.
If I could just add one additional note that's very important, particularly right now, as it's an issue that is going to be at the fore, is the role of the United Nations. There's a special rapporteur that has been appointed, or which will be formalized soon, on human rights, the situation in Afghanistan and human rights. That role is going to be absolutely critical. We need visibility on the situation on the ground. We need eyes and ears, and we need engagement of that actor. And just as important, perhaps even more, the role of UNAMA, and ensuring that UNAMA maintains both its political mandate and its human rights unit, and that it has a presence throughout the country. That will be absolutely critical. UNAMA's mandate is up for renewal, and it's an area where we should see as one of our, where we should have a collective interest, ensuring that we have a strong UNAMA with the requisite resources and presence to enable Afghans to have some level of engagement with an actor that can address their interests, as well as to facilitate political dialogue with the Taliban. They should be at the forefront, not just of the humanitarian issue, but in terms of using their good offices with the Taliban, as well as making sure that Afghans have an address to take their complaints. It's important for UNAMA and other institutions to continue supporting that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really important point that you added. I appreciate that. And I hope that the current UN dynamics that we're experiencing right now because of other situations do not prevent an effective renewal of that UNAMA mandate. And I would definitely commend our viewers to an event that CSIS did last week on UNAMA and the questions around that renewal process, because it's a really fascinating and very, very important topic. So thank you, Special Envoy Amiri, and thank you for being here, for all the work that you're doing in this extremely difficult situation. Know that you have a lot of supporters who are rooting you on and wishing you success in your work. And thank you so much for being here with us today. I want to pick up on a number of the Special Envoy's remarks and bring in our panel, because we have 3 amazing speakers who have a depth of knowledge and experience in Afghanistan, and I think are going to have some really important insights to add. So let me introduce our speakers, and then we'll launch into a conversation. First, we have Heather Barr, who is Associate Director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Heather has been at Human Rights Watch since 2011, where she actually started as the Afghanistan researcher, so a long history in this region. I especially want to thank her for joining us from Pakistan, where it is pretty late at night. We have Horia Mosadiq, who is founder of the Safety and Risk Mitigation Organization in Afghanistan. She is a longtime Afghan human rights activist, analyst, journalist, spent nearly 10 years at Amnesty International. She, along with Ann Richard, who I'm about to introduce, have launched the Afghanistan Human Rights Coordination Mechanism, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about, and how to bring the voices of Afghans into the human rights conversation. And of course, Ann Richard, who is Distinguished Fellow and Afghanistan Coordination Lead at Freedom House. From 2012 to 2017, she served as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. So much experience on refugee and humanitarian issues. And she previously served in senior positions at the International Rescue Committee and the Peace Corps and in the White House Office of Management and Budget. So a fantastic lineup of experts in this space. And I want to start, Horia, with you to give us, your reactions and to the Special Envoy's overview of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan, and give us, from your perspective, a sense of what's happened in Afghanistan since the Taliban captured Kabul and solidified its control over the rest of the country. How has the situation in practice changed for women, certainly, but also for human rights advocates, for activists, for underrepresented and minority groups, and for Afghans in general?
Thank you very much. First of all, I also would like to thank you and also Anne for putting me forward to be part of this event, and also thank you to the Special Envoy, Ms. Rina Amiri, for her incredible remarks that I think after what she described about the situation, I don't know how much I can add to that. Unfortunately, after 15th of August, maybe the first few weeks, Afghanistan made a lot of international headlines through the international media, particularly in relation to the exodus and chaos that was happening at the airport. But unfortunately, there are not many reports that you hear now, particularly in the international media, on what's happening in Afghanistan. I would like to focus on a number of issues, like since Taliban took over, the number of the disappearances, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrests, and also suppression of people who simply peacefully demonstrate their rights to freedom of expression or assembly have been violated on and on. We have reports or seen hundreds of people who were, because of their association with the former government, whether they were military or civilians, have been disappeared, detained, tortured, and some of them have been killed by the Taliban. And also we are having a lot of other reports that you can hear on and on, that people simply for celebrating the flag, the national flag day in Afghanistan, have been humiliated, they were beaten up, and they were somehow tortured and insulted publicly across Afghanistan. This is another issue. And the third issue is that many people believe that, because Taliban are Pashtun, and it may only they are persecuting the non-Pashtun population. But this is not true, because what we have seen, so many cases of attacks, extrajudicial killings, disappearances, torture, and all other forms of human rights violations are happening also in the Pashtun-dominated area as well. We have seen a massacre that happened in Kandahar at early days of Taliban takeover, and we are having a lot of reports from eastern part of Afghanistan, particularly from Nangarhar, Kunar, and Laghman provinces, where Taliban are committing mass human rights violations against different population in the country and under different names. So, and like these are unfortunately the situation that we are facing now. And just taking a little step forward and going back to the Norway or Oslo summit that happened, soon after Taliban were invited to Oslo, we have seen that how Taliban have drastically changed their tactics for worse. They have taken systematically attacks on women rights, on women protesters. They have started suppressing and detaining journalists and other civil society activists. So, and before that, like they would hide that it was not the Taliban who arrested or who have detained the protesters or journalists and others, but after Oslo summit, it boosted their confidence to the extent that they are publicly saying that, yes, we have raided a safe house, we have detained this many people, and then they are coming with all sorts of other accusations against the people that they have arrested. We have also seen that soon after Taliban went to Geneva, then they took things to another level to put travel ban on people, stop evacuation, and then, you know, like also other, what you say, like restrictions on Afghan people, on freedom of expression, on media, and also on civil society, and even ordinary Afghans. So then we go to another step when Biden started announcing that he would release the reserve fund, and then he would allow Afghans or Afghanistan to use that. Of course, when that reserve fund goes to the Afghanistan National Bank. But then soon after that, then another step started, which is home-to-home search. So now in the past a week or so, when the home-to-home searches started in several provinces of Afghanistan, including Kabul, Taliban are continuing to harass people, beat people, torture people, confiscating their properties, personal properties, private properties, intimidating people. And, like what we have seen, like several NGOs, their properties have been confiscated by the Taliban. Many members of, working for the international or national organizations, they have been intimidated, harassed, and their personal properties have been taken. And this situation is going on and on. And I think even today, the last updates that I had, when Taliban are raiding and going to people's home under this searching thing, they are not just looking for weapons. They are looking for individuals. They are looking for documents. They are ransacking people. They are like turning their homes upside down. One of the female colleagues of mine, she reported that her neighbor who belonged to the former government, administration, their home have been turned upside down. Taliban almost took everything out of their home. They put everything, and they said this is the property of the government. And as they were leaving, they broke down the windows, the doors, and even the entire property. So this is how things are getting out of control. The moment you show that you are giving them a recognition, I think then you will see also the other level of violence and atrocities committed by the group.
Wow, thank you so much, Horia. Fascinating. I want to bring in Heather to react to that. Heather, you all put out a report recently on an issue that maybe isn't getting as much attention, which is what's happening to LGBTQ people across Afghanistan. And I want to get a sense from you of what's happening in that space. Give us a summary of that report. But I also would love to get your reaction to, are you seeing this dynamic that Horia is laying out where a bit of recognition, a bit of engagement with the Taliban from other governments is empowering them to take more repressive steps at home?
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I largely agree. I had an interesting discussion this morning with a European diplomat who was kind of saying similar things. He was saying to me that she'd been really struck by how increasingly confident the Taliban seem to be in their interactions with diplomats, how they, how they seem sure of themselves, and like, their star is rising, and they've become better and better at kind of using the language of diplomacy and kind of, throwing arguments back at diplomats. The diplomat was saying to me, for example, that they were arguing recently that, yes, you're pressuring us so much to reopen girls' schools, but you're the ones who have helped, all of the teachers to flee the country, and now we don't have any teachers anymore. I think, I was having a conversation today about how I think that they've really kind of taken advantage of the humanitarian crisis in a way. First of all, to deflect blame from themselves to the international community. And I want to talk in a minute about just how easy the international community, and particularly Joe Biden, has made it for them to do that. But secondly, I think also it's compelled the international community to engage with them urgently. Like, there hasn't been any space to kind of wait and see how things are going. And so because, donors are, many donors are trying urgently to get assistance to Afghans who are starving to death. And that's meant that there have been all these interactions which the Taliban have seen as recognizing them in some way. And so, I just feel like this entire kind of response from the international community has largely been a disaster. I appreciate Rina Amiri's comments so much, and I appreciate the expertise and caring that she brings to this role, but her boss has really screwed this up. And I feel like what we've needed from the beginning is for the whole international community to really come together, particularly those countries that say that they have a feminist foreign policy, and really strategize about how to manage this tricky situation where you've got Taliban abuses on one side, humanitarian crisis on the other, and come up with united and strategic ways to deal with this. And we just have none of that. I was thinking back to the G7 meeting that happened, I think, at the end of August, where, they issued a statement saying they were all going to work together to figure out together how to deal with the Taliban. I can't see any evidence that that's happened at all. Now, more than 6 months later. So just to talk for a moment about the report we did on LGBT people, it was such a privilege to work on this report, because after a lot of years working on Afghanistan, I feel like these are voices that I had never had a chance to hear before. As Horia knows very well, this is an issue that is very rarely discussed, even among kind of human rights circles in Afghanistan. I think that the kind of key point that I learned from this research is that, okay, we have this whole level of the Taliban engaging in abuses themselves, and Horia's done a great job of outlining some of those. But we also have this space that the Taliban have created for other people to engage in abuses. And that is a lot of what we were hearing about from the LGBT Afghans that we were able to speak to. Is it's not necessarily that the Taliban came to kill them or to threaten them or to beat them or to attack them. It's more that if there was somebody else out there who wanted to harm them, a neighbor who disliked them, or somebody homophobic who knew about their sexuality, sexual orientation, or gender identity, or an ex-partner who wanted revenge or something, on the 14th of August, that person would have felt like, well, I can't really do anything. I don't like this person, but I can't really do anything. And on the 16th of August, people felt like it's open season. I'm completely free to attack this person because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And not only will I not be punished, I'll almost certainly be rewarded somehow and congratulated. And what I was a little bit, we've spent so many years kind of criticizing the previous government over their human rights failings, which were, many and serious. And in that context, I found it kind of interesting, like how the people that we interviewed for the LGBT report actually did have quite a bit of confidence in the police and the justice system under the previous government. You know, they didn't feel like the police would do much to protect them from crimes committed against them, but they felt like the existence of that system would protect them from some forms of serious harm. And that's all gone now. That all disappeared on August 15th, along with, I mean, I thought it was so powerful what Rina Amiri said about the women who woke up that morning and were judges and business people and whoever and went to bed not being any of those things anymore. And I think the LGBT people woke up feeling like they'd found some kind of space for themselves and a community and a life. And that was gone at the end of the day. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Heather, for laying that out for us. It's just heartbreaking. I want to come back to this discussion in a moment about sort of U.S. policy in the international community, but I just want to pause before we do that. And, you know, you made a comment at the beginning about how the Taliban is increasingly confident. And one of the things that's really struck me over the past 6 months is that Afghan women and Afghan civil society organizations are so incredibly confident and continuing to be so incredibly active and vocal, expressing their interests, their desires, their demands for human rights, and not being intimidated by the situation, despite the danger to them and others. And so I want to turn to Anne to talk a little bit about the coalition, the initiative that you and Horia have launched, which is really about Afghans, civil society organizations continuing to come together to work on human rights issues, and talk a little bit about how that came together, what its objectives are, and what your plans are. And you're muted, so just hit the unmute, please.
Thank you very much, Marty. And I want to make 3 points. I want to describe this mechanism that we have been putting together since last fall, in response to what happened last summer and the needs, focusing on the needs of human rights defenders who are inside Afghanistan or in exile and have played such an important role for the last 20 years. I also want to talk a little bit about the humanitarian crisis right now inside Afghanistan and how human rights work is an essential piece of a response to what's going on inside Afghanistan. And also, I want to talk about some of the things Horia talked about in terms of this tough last few weeks about what the day-to-day fears are of human rights defenders inside Afghanistan. So the Afghanistan Human Rights Coordination Mechanism came about after colleagues at Freedom House getting seed money from Open Society foundations, and then I came on board and reached out to people like Horia from the Safety Risk Management Organization, Aziz Rafi from the Afghan Civil Society Forum, other caring Afghans, and also international NGOs like the International Federation for Human Rights based in Paris and Madre based in New York that is concerned about the safety of women leaders. We came together to design a way to link international human rights groups with those human rights defenders who, many of whom are still inside Afghanistan. Some are in hiding. Some are wondering if they can resume their work. Many are very fearful of what the Taliban could do to them and to their families. But they were and have been people who very courageously stood up for what was right for the last 20 years. And we owe them, just like many American veterans feel like they owe their translators, their truck drivers, American diplomats say, the people who worked alongside us in the U.S. Embassy, we owe them. Certainly, we owe so many people we encouraged as Americans to speak up, speak out, take these very brave stances, push forward rights inside Afghanistan. We owe them, and we should not be turning our back and abandoning them right now. Some human rights leaders have gotten out of Afghanistan, many have not. And so what we want to do is focus on getting them to safety, if it's possible to do that, we want to make sure we are providing support for the needs of human rights defenders who are inside Afghanistan and for human rights defenders who are in exile and trying to figure out how, while being dispersed around the world and in lots of different countries, and not necessarily coming to the United States, because that's a harder destination right now for a lot of human rights defenders to reach, to try to get them the support they need to resume their work, if at all possible. I think it's going to be very, very challenging. And clearly we want the voices of Afghan people to speak out right now, even as the Taliban tries to dampen their ability to have free speech, even as the Taliban goes up against journalists inside Afghanistan. We want to make sure that the concerns, the views, the issues of concern to Afghans are reaching decision makers around the world and are not forgotten, are not just sort of swept under the rug. I think that the severe crisis inside Afghanistan in terms of financial crisis, winter threats to people, ordinary Afghans being subjected to so many hardships right now, is something that Americans understand. Humanitarian groups try to go in and try to address that. But as important that is for the survival of Afghans, human rights, the appreciation of and respect for human rights is essential for Afghan society, for any kind of future for Afghan people. You know, the Taliban is a real gets small degree of support from inside Afghanistan. Most Afghans do not support the Taliban and what it's trying to do. And it's a country where there are significant percentage of women who are widows because of the fighting that has gone on and the conflict. And so we need to have an Afghanistan where women and girls and minorities can play active roles in society to build a functioning society, and not to have the Taliban succeed, not just in suppressing the voices of these people, but in fact to terrorize these people. You know, this past week has been very tough, and Horia is the expert, but in talking to my Afghan colleagues, what they've heard over and over again is, in terms of these house-to-house searches or office-to-office searches, the Taliban only needs to drop by one day per year to make people feel fearful for another 364 days. They can very efficiently disrupt lives and undermine the well-being of families, and they are particularly focused on stamping out the voices of people that we owe so much to. So that's the piece that I want to remind our Americans in the audience, is that when we talk about rescuing people, we really owe a debt to these very courageous Afghans. And in talking to them, I wouldn't blame them if they wanted to just throw up their hands and say, I'm going to curl up in a ball. Life is too hard right now. But instead, over and over again, we have people wanting to be heard, wanting to get their voices out. And that's what we're trying to do with this mechanism. Horia will, I'm sure, have more to say on this.
Thank you so much, and thank you for putting that so powerfully, both the power of that intimidation that they're feeling, but also how strong Afghans have been over the past 6 months. Horia, I do want to come back to you, but I wonder if you can talk about anything you want to add on this mechanism, of course, but talk about what are the kinds of strategies and engagements you would like to see from the international community. We heard a little bit from the special envoy about her engagement with Afghan civil society and Afghan women in particular. But what kind of engagement would you like to see in terms of international partnerships, engagement with the UN? What do you think would actually make a difference on the ground in terms of what the US government could be doing right now?
Well, I think there is a lot the international community can do. I think, first of all, any engagement, any future engagement with the Taliban, it shouldn't be a blank check as it was in Oslo, in Geneva, and in other instances. There have to be given and taken, and if they are prepared to do that, I think when you want to, if they are coming for a meeting, you want to know that you're taking certain actions before you're engaging with them. Like, yes, I think this is good that women and girls can go to school, and that can wait till March, but what about women access to employment? They could immediately announce that as of next week, all women civil servants, they can return to their work. And unfortunately, this didn't happen. They could easily say that, like all the detainees, all the people who have been detained, because of, they participate in a demonstration or because they simply were critical of the Taliban in a TV, program or something like that, they could be released as of, tomorrow. And unfortunately, that did not happen. So
let's just ask you a follow-up on that, let me just ask you, I'm just really curious to get your view. Is that not happening because of a philosophical refusal, an ideological refusal, or is it a negotiating tactic? In other words, because that really influences how other governments engage. Are we trying to convince them to change ideologically their views on women, or is it that they're waiting for the right carrot and stick sort of negotiation to make those moves?
Yeah, well, definitely, I think that should be like a form of diplomacy that they are using. They have been using that, with the previous government, and you're using it with other situations as well. That could definitely, I don't think this is something to do ideological, because many of the Taliban leaders, their daughters are educated in very prestigious universities and schools. There have been an Afghan analyst report about that. So, they can't, use that double standard that the Sharia apply only for women inside Afghanistan, but this does not apply for the leadership of the Taliban. Like they should also look at the other Islamic countries, like even Saudi Arabia, which is one of the strictest Islamic countries in the world. They are making changes, they are giving more space to women. They are trying to, give the women the right to vote or the right to drive or the right to participate in different aspects of the social, political, and economic life. So, but then in Afghanistan, unfortunately, what we are seeing is that always regression. The other example, they can use Pakistan. They have female prime ministers. They have women members of the parliament. The women are participating, and they have such a strong role in different aspects of Pakistan political life. Why there is no learning? Why there is no, at least, like a pressure to look at those examples, I think this is something that it can happen, not only in terms of the women's rights, but, I'm talking about the general human rights of the Afghan population, whether it is, men, women, boys and girls, and it should apply to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very good point. So with that in mind, Anne, I want to come back to you. You were in government for a long time. You know a lot about diplomacy and trying to convince governments to do things they might be reluctant to do, whether that's on the humanitarian front or on the human rights front. How are you thinking about how the U.S. leverages what influence it has in this situation, which might be limited over the Taliban, but also its influence over third countries who might be able to move the Taliban off of some of these positions? We heard Special Envoy Amiri talk about her visit to Saudi Arabia and to Qatar. How are you thinking about the U.S. leveraging its power in this situation?
My experience has been that the U.S. has a lot of influence over what happens in the world, and there seems to be in the media right now, and perhaps for some in the White House, a desire to turn the page, to move on. But at the same time, the U.S. government has lots and lots of staff members who have visited Afghanistan, who have served in Afghanistan, who have Afghan friends, like the veterans who feel they owe their lives to Afghans. There is so much more knowledge, experience, and feeling for Afghanistan, legitimate, genuine feeling for Afghanistan from the rank and file and on up to assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, at the State Department, at the Department of Homeland Security, at the Defense Department, we're at the National Security Council, where people do not want to forget about Afghanistan and do want to find ways to make a difference. And so clearly this is something that cannot be done without other countries involved. You know, we can critique the way the Norwegians organized perhaps the conversations with the Taliban, but the role played by the Norwegians as in pursuit of peace and in pursuit of a better situation is something that I applaud. It's interesting, Rina Amiri talked about how she would like to see more involvement from majority Muslim countries in trying to have a conversation with the Taliban, you know, challenge their very restrictive view of Islam. And that is something that's been suggested a couple of times in my conversations, talking to different people in Washington and overseas about how, you know, who are the best people to engage with the Taliban. Clearly the special envoys like Tom West for the United States and his counterparts are playing very important roles. So I don't think there are a lot of people who can influence the Taliban from the outside, but I think the people who can, UN officials, special envoys, potentially certain governments, I think we really have to ensure that their efforts are taken seriously and are pursued, and we get as much information to them then from the people who are inside Afghanistan as we can.
Absolutely. You know, an hour is never enough time to talk about these issues. Heather, I'm going to come back to you for the last word on the same question. You're sitting in Pakistan right now, so you have the regional view of what's happening. Is the U.S. effectively using its influence over other countries who can maybe move the Taliban off of some of these issues? And what more would you like to see them doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already expressed some frustrations with, you know, the whole approach we've seen from the White House, you know, from a kind of strategic level to a feeling of personal responsibility level. I think we've been missing that from the president in particular at a moment when we need it so much. I think I really take your point, Anne, that the U.S. does have influence. The Taliban wants recognition. They want to be seen as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. They seemed particularly put out, for example, at the moment when they were denied the chance to take Afghanistan's seat at the United Nations. They're in a desperate financial situation. They inherited you know, a system where 75% of all public services were funded by external donors. And, you know, so if they want to have stability and stay in power, they could certainly use financial assistance and support, even if they don't care about their own people starving to death, which they may or may not. And so there is leverage there. There just needs to be, you know, a genuine interest in trying to figure out how to use that leverage. And I think it's the interest that's missing a lot of times, and a desire to work in coalition. And I really take the point about the importance of the OIC and Muslim countries, but I also don't want that to be a way to pass the buck and say, well, we don't really have any influence, it's really down to the OIC to figure out what to do. No, like the US needs to be working with the OIC. It's clear that OIC countries are unlikely to become major financial donors to Afghanistan. The money is going to continue to flow from the US and close US allies that were likely contributing countries. And so those different entities need to come together and have a shared plan about how to deal with a government. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call them a government. They're not a government, an entity which is just engaging in the most extraordinary human rights abuses. I mean, it's extraordinary that in 2022, we have a group that's completely rolled back virtually all aspects of women's rights, and the rest of the world seems to be kind of sitting on their hands and going, oh, what a shame, like, what does feminist foreign policy mean if we can't put more energy and more caring into trying to stand by Afghan women and Afghans in general?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that reminder. And it does remind me that the world continues to move on to the next human rights crisis, the next foreign policy crisis. There will always be something distracting us from these really important issues. And so it's really incumbent on all of us to continue to use our voices as best we can to keep holding, in our case, the U.S. government accountable, but also to empower and support the voices of people on the ground and people doing this work day to day. And so it's really heartening to hear from all of you, as well as from Special Envoy Amiri, the work that is being done not only to influence the Taliban and to try and move them off of some of these positions and really try and increase the human rights space on the ground, but also in particular to center the voices of Afghans in that conversation and to make sure that we're equally empowering them and helping them develop strategies to do their work in a repressive environment, and to realize that even in a best case scenario, we have a Taliban that is not going to respect human rights in all aspects. And they are not an accountable democratic government under any circumstances. And so we have to continue to deploy the strategies that we've developed in other repressive regimes and repressive countries to support civil society and activists in Afghanistan in the long term. And so I just want to thank all three of you for the work that you are doing every single day in that effort, and to say that we will continue to do our best to support you and to support those voices and to continue to raise attention to this issue. And I just want to thank you all for taking the time to be here today, and for our audience for watching. And with that, I will wish you all a very good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.